By the time my mother realized I was really gone, I was already halfway across town in the back of an Uber with a duffel bag on my lap and an army ship date in my pocket. She didn't wake up for the goodbye. She didn't hear me leave. She didn't notice my room had been emptied out in pieces over the last few weeks. What finally got her attention was a 4-page letter sitting on the kitchen counter where I used to leave school forms she forgot to sign. 6 hours later, my phone lit up with her name. How could you leave like this, without saying goodbye? I stared at the screen for a long time before I put it face down on my thigh. That message should have made me angry. Didn't. Anger had burned out way before that morning. What I felt instead was something colder and quieter. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. More like the numb relief of finally setting down something heavy you were never supposed to carry that long in the first place. Because the truth was, my mother had been leaving me for years. She just did it in smaller pieces. The first time, it happened so slowly I almost missed it. I was 10 when she married Phil. My biological father had been in prison since I was 3, nonviolent drug charges, 15 years. My mom almost never said his name out loud. If I asked about him, she'd give me these short, flat answers that somehow closed the whole room. So by the time Phil showed up, I think part of me wanted to believe that maybe this was how things got fixed. Maybe this was the point in the movie where the normal family finally starts. And for a little while it actually looked possible. Phil wasn't warm exactly, but he was present. That alone felt huge. He took me fishing twice that first summer. Asked me how school was going. Bought me a basketball even though I liked reading more than sports and probably should have noticed I had no clue what to do with it. Still, I appreciated the effort. When you grow up not expecting much from adults, even mediocre kindness can feel like rescue. My mother smiled more that year too. She had that look women get when they think they've finally dragged themselves out of the hard part of life and into the stable version. Bills got paid on time. The kitchen stayed stocked. Nobody was pounding on the door looking for my father. Nobody was crying at 2 in the morning over money. Phil had a real job, a truck that always ran, and the kind of dependable routines my mother treated like romance. For a year, I thought I had maybe slipped into a better life by accident. Then my sister Violet was born. And I don't mean things got harder in the normal new baby way. I mean I watched my place in that house get reassigned almost overnight. Before Violet, we used to eat dinner at the table most nights. After Violet, my mom and Phil started taking their plates into the living room to eat near the baby, while I sat in the kitchen by myself with the TV low in the other room and the sound of them talking like I had somehow been seated in the wrong life. First, I made excuses for it. The baby needs attention. The baby has a schedule. The baby is fussy. Those are normal things. I know that now. I even knew it then, a little. But normal things don't usually come with that particular feeling of being quietly downgraded. It wasn't just that Violet needed things. It was that once she arrived, I became the kid expected not to need anything at all. That shift got baked into everything faster than I could understand it. If I asked for help with homework, my mother said, "Not now. I've got the baby." If I asked if someone could pick me up after school, it became, "You can walk." The baby finally fell asleep. If I said I was hungry and dinner was late, I got, "You're old enough to make a sandwich." I was 11, then 12, then 13. And every year, somehow, I became old enough for another kind of neglect. By the time my brother Ethan was born 2 years later, I had already started adjusting in ways no kid should know how to do. I stopped asking for rides unless the weather was bad enough to make refusal look cruel. I stopped mentioning school stuff unless a signature was absolutely required. I stopped hovering in the kitchen around dinner time because if they wanted me there, they would have called me in. They usually didn't. The weird thing about being neglected inside a house full of people is that it makes you question your own reality. If somebody hits you, you know it happened. If they scream at you, you know what to call it. But when they just keep forgetting you in ways that are individually small and collectively devastating, it gets harder to name. You start bargaining with yourself. Maybe I'm dramatic. Maybe they're tired. Maybe this week was just bad. Maybe next month will be better. That's how kids survive things that would look unbearable if you saw the whole pattern at once. We break it into little lies we can live with. The first time they left me behind on purpose, I was 14. I didn't know that's what it was at first. I came downstairs on a Saturday morning expecting cereal, cartoons, maybe the usual slow weekend noise. The house was empty. No note, no text, no sound except the refrigerator humming and the dog next door barking at something I couldn't see. I stood in the kitchen for a full minute thinking maybe they were outside. Maybe Phil was mowing. Maybe my mom had taken the little kids somewhere close. Then I noticed Violet's shoes were gone from by the door. Ethan's little jacket too. So were Phil's keys. I texted my mother. "Where are you guys?" No answer. I texted again 20 minutes later. Still nothing. At that point, I should probably tell you I panicked. I didn't. That's what makes neglect so ugly. Trains the panic out of you. I didn't think they'd died. I didn't think something terrible had happened. I thought the most likely explanation was also the most embarrassing one. They had gone somewhere without me. 6 hours later they came home with shopping bags and Dave and Buster's cups and that particular loud, bright energy people have when they've had a good day together. Violet ran in first, excited enough to trip over the rug. She had a stuffed animal bigger than her torso and pizza sauce on her sleeve. "Mommy won me this," she shouted. Then she saw me standing by the stairs and stopped just long enough to add, almost helpfully, "We got pizza and played games and Ethan cried on the carousel." I looked at my mother. That's the part one remember most clearly. The exact half second before she chose her lie. She had grocery bags in both hands. Phil was behind her carrying Ethan. The whole entryway smelled like fried food and department store perfume and outside air. My mother saw my face, looked away almost instantly and said, "We thought you were still sleeping." I had been awake since 7. She knew that. She'd walked past my room twice that morning. But the lie was quicker, easier, lighter to carry than the truth. Phil didn't correct her. That mattered too. He could have said, "Actually, we just decided to make a day of it." He could have said, "Sorry, bud. Thought you had plans." He could have said literally anything that treated me like a human being standing in front of him instead of an inconvenience that needed to be managed. He said nothing. That was the day I stopped thinking of him as the guy who took me fishing. After that, it became a pattern. Every few weeks, I'd hear the garage door rumble open while I was in my room and something in my chest would drop before I even made it to the window. I'd pull the curtain back and see the back of our minivan easing down the driveway like the house itself was trying not to get caught. Sometimes I'd text, "Where are you guys?" The answer usually came 15 or 20 minutes later. Just running errands. That phrase got used so often it stopped meaning anything. Errands with movie tickets. Errands with arcade prizes. Errands with takeout bags for 4. Errands with matching wristbands from places kids get excited about and older siblings pretend not to care about. The worst part wasn't even the lie. It was how casual it became. My mother stopped sounding guilty by the 3rd or 4th time. Like once she realized I wasn't going to scream or cry or make a scene big enough to force accountability, she relaxed into it. Neglect gets bolder when it learns you can survive it quietly. And I did survive it quietly. That was probably my biggest mistake. I became easy to ignore. Easy kids don't get rewarded. They get deprioritized. By 15, I had my own routines that barely included them. I walked home from school, made ramen or grilled cheese if there was anything in the fridge, did homework at the kitchen counter, and went upstairs before the little kids got too loud. On paper, I probably looked independent, mature, low maintenance. In reality, I was just learning how to shrink without disappearing completely. My mother loved calling me mature. She'd say it with this relieved little smile, like my ability to need less was a gift I had chosen to give her. "You're so easy compared to the little ones." Easy. That word used to make my skin crawl. Because easy is what people call children when they're grateful those children won't expose how badly they're being failed. The house itself changed too. Not physically at first. Emotionally. Certain rooms stopped being for me. The living room became baby territory, then family territory, then their territory. My mother, Phil, Violet, Ethan. They'd sit in this soft little circle on the couch with snacks and blankets and one of those stupid animated movies playing while I ate in the kitchen or stayed upstairs long enough to spare myself the invitation that never came. Holidays started feeling stranger than regular days. Not because they were worse, because they exposed the gap. On regular Tuesdays, you can tell yourself everyone's busy. On birthdays, on Christmas, on school milestones, the absence looks more deliberate. My 16th birthday cured me of hope. I'd spent days pretending I didn't care. That sounds dramatic, but it was actually practical. Hope had become embarrassing in that house. Still, some part of me expected something. Not a party. Not balloons. I wasn't stupid. But maybe a cake from the grocery store. Maybe my favorite fast food. Maybe even just my mother remembering before I came downstairs and had to remind her I existed. I got home from school a little after 3:30. The house was empty. No decorations. No note. No smell of dinner. Nothing. I stood in the kitchen, backpack still on, staring at the counter like maybe if I gave it enough time the surprise would reveal itself. Maybe they were hiding in the den. Maybe they'd planned something for later. Maybe. By 6:30 I already knew. By 7 I heard the garage door. They came in laughing. Olive Garden bags in Phil's hands. Breadsticks sticking out of one paper sleeve. Ethan carrying one of those little crayons they give kids. Violet chattering about something I didn't catch because all the blood in my body seemed to rush into my face at once. My mother saw me by the stairs and stopped. "Oh," she said. "Just oh." Then, "I thought you were eating at a friend's house." I had never said that. Not that day. Not ever. And the thing about a lie that lazy is it tells you exactly how little they think they owe you. She wasn't even trying to make it believable anymore. She just needed a sentence fast enough to stand between herself and shame. Violet was 6 then. Old enough to notice tone. Old enough to study faces. She looked from me to the takeout bags and back to my mother. Then, in this small confused voice that somehow hurt worse than if she'd been cruel, she asked, "Why didn't we get him a cake?" My mother barely looked at me when she answered. "He's too old for that stuff now." That night I went upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and cried so hard my ribs hurt. I hadn't cried in years. That was the part that scared me. Not the birthday, not even the lie, the crying. Because it meant something in me I thought had already died was still alive enough to get hurt. And once I realized that, I knew I had 2 choices. Either keep living in that house until they finished teaching me I was worth whatever scraps were left after their real family was done eating. Or leave before I believed them. That was the night I started planning. Not dramatically. Not with a packed bag and a speech in the mirror. Quietly. I was 17 and working part-time at Wendy's for $11.15 an hour. I opened a bank account my mother didn't know about. Every check went there. I stopped buying stupid stuff. No headphones, no fast food after shifts, no random gas station snacks. None of the little things that make being 17 feel less like waiting. Money wasn't freedom yet, but it was the first shape of freedom I could actually hold. I started doing the math. How much I'd need to get out. How fast I could get there. What options existed for someone with no parent in his corner and no realistic path to college without drowning in debt. That was when the military stopped being an abstract thing other people did and started looking like a door. I researched branches late at night with my bedroom light off and my laptop turned low. Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army. I didn't tell anybody. Not Amanda. Not teachers. Not even myself out loud at first. Saying it would have made it real, and real plans are harder to protect when you still live with the people you're escaping. The strange thing is, once I had a plan, I got calmer. Not happier. Sharper. I stopped waiting for my mother to notice me because I was finally building a life that didn't require her to. And maybe that's why she noticed even less. People can feel when you've stopped begging for them emotionally. Some react by chasing you. Others just settle deeper into the convenience of your silence. My mother chose convenience. The weeks after that birthday blurred into school, work, quiet savings, and the careful emotional discipline of not expecting rescue from anyone inside that house. If they left without me, I didn't text. If they lied, I let the lie sit there between us like old furniture. If Violet asked why I never came on family outings anymore, I told her I was busy. That wasn't even entirely false. Surviving them had become a full-time job. Phil and my mother seemed almost relieved by how little I asked for. Sometimes I wonder if that's when adults decide they've gotten away with something. Not when the child cries, when the child stops. And the only person in that house who seemed even a little uneasy about it was Violet. She was still a kid, but she noticed patterns. Not enough to understand them fully, just enough to look at me sometimes like she knew a sentence had been spoken in the room that she hadn't been allowed to hear. She'd ask small questions. You working again? You eating with us? You want to come if we go to the mall? The first two came from curiosity. The third usually came after she'd already been told I wasn't going. I always said no lightly, like it didn't matter. By then I'd gotten good at that voice. The casual one. The one neglected kids use so the adults around them never have to face what they're doing. But inside I was already somewhere else. Already counting down. Already imagining a morning when I could leave that house before anyone was awake and not owe them one more performance of gratitude. I didn't know then that the first person who would make me feel seen before I left wouldn't be my mother. It wouldn't be Phil either. It would be the man who had been gone so long I had stopped picturing his face. And that changed everything. Once I decided I was leaving, my life split into two versions. There was the visible one. School. Wendy's. Homework. Dinner if I felt like being downstairs while everyone else acted like the room belonged to them. The same house, the same people, the same routines that had trained me to expect less and less until even disappointment started to feel repetitive. Then there was the real one, the hidden version. The one made out of paychecks, browser history, military forums, branch comparisons, late-night math, and the kind of quiet planning people only do when they've already understood that no one is coming to save them. I got serious about money first. At 17, $11.15 an hour doesn't sound like much, and it isn't, not once taxes get done with it and gas and food and life take their cut. But money behaves differently when it has one job. Mine had one job. Get me out. Every check went into the separate account. I didn't tell my mother because that would have turned it into family money by default. That's how things worked in our house. Nothing had to be stolen outright. Adults just had ways of making your resources feel communal until your autonomy looked selfish. If I'd said I was saving, she would have wanted to know for what. If I'd named a goal, she would have had an opinion. If she'd known how close I was getting to actual escape, she might have started paying attention for all the wrong reasons. So I kept my mouth shut. I picked up extra shifts when I could. Covered lunches. Stayed late on Fridays. Took the annoying Sunday blocks nobody wanted because they wrecked your whole day. My manager liked me because I was consistent and didn't complain much, which is another sentence that sounds flattering until you realize how many neglected kids get praised for functioning while exhausted. By the end of 8 months, I'd saved $3,200. I checked the number 3 times that night in the Wendy's parking lot before I drove home. $3,200 wasn't my life is secure money. It was, I have enough to stop pretending I'm trapped money. That mattered more. Around that time, the military stopped being a vague backup plan and became the main one. I read everything. Army versus Marines. Benefits. Signing timelines. Job availability. Physical standards. Basic training start windows. Housing. Tuition help. What scores I'd need if I didn't want to get shoved into whatever was left. I spent nights on message boards reading posts from people who loved it, people who hated it, people who regretted not choosing a different MOS, people who swore it saved them, people who said it only gave them new damage to replace the old kind. I read all of it, not because I was looking for a perfect answer, because I needed an answer strong enough to compete with staying. That's the thing people don't always understand when they hear a kid join the military at 18. They picture patriotism, family tradition, adventure, tough guy fantasies. Sometimes it is those things. For me, at least at first, it was the cleanest available exit. A structured one, a legal one, a respected one. Nobody could call it running away if the government signed off on it. I looked hardest at the Air Force for a while. Better quality of life, people said. Smarter move long-term. Then the Navy, because I liked the idea of disappearing so completely I could be in the middle of the ocean while everyone back home tried to reassemble the version of me they'd ignored. But the branch that kept making brutal sense was the Army. Fastest timeline. Clear path. Less waiting around for my life to start. I finally called a recruiter 3 weeks before my 18th birthday. I made the call from the Wendy's parking lot after a closing shift. Apron still on. Fryer smell in my hoodie. Hands still faintly sticky from soda syrup and bleach water. I remember staring at my cracked phone screen while it rang and thinking, if this guy answers, my life is going to split in half. He answered on the second ring. He sounded exactly like every recruiter in every movie I'd ever half paid attention to. Confident, direct, already treating me like someone with motion in him. He asked the standard questions. Age, graduation timeline, any legal trouble, medical history, drug use. I answered carefully, honestly enough to not screw myself later, cautiously enough to keep the conversation alive. When I told him I wanted to move fast, he got interested. How fast? As fast as possible. He laughed once. That usually means there's a story. There is. He let that sit without asking for details. I appreciated that. Good recruiters, I think, know when a kid is calling because he's looking for a career and when he's calling because home has become emotionally uninhabitable. He just said, all right, then let's make fast useful. That line stayed with me. We met in person 4 days later in a strip mall office next to a tax place and a nail salon. The Army posters on the wall looked slightly faded, and the coffee in the waiting area smelled like it had been reheated since the Bush administration. But the room still felt more serious than my house had in years. Serious in a good way. Like if I signed enough forms in the right order, adulthood might finally become something I was allowed to step into instead of just watching other people control. The recruiter asked what I wanted out of the Army. I gave him the safe answers first. Stability, direction, college money later maybe. Then he asked again, not with different words, just with his face. And because some adults have a way of making the truth cheaper to tell, I shrugged and said, I need out. He nodded like that explained more than any prepared speech would have. Fair enough, he said. Then let's get you options. That mattered. Options. Nobody in my house had talked to me like I had options in years. At home, I was the oldest kid who could handle himself. At Wendy's, I was the reliable closer. At school, I was the quiet one who did fine. In that office, for the first time in a long while, I felt like a person being evaluated for a future instead of managed for convenience. The next big piece was the ASVAB. I took it on a Tuesday during lunch break at school. Even typing that now makes me laugh a little because it sounds so absurdly casual compared to what it meant. Kids around me were stressing about homecoming, senior parking, college essays, prom stuff 6 months away, all the normal senior year noise. I was sitting for a military aptitude test that was basically going to decide what kinds of exits the next few years of my life could include. I scored an 82, high enough for anything I actually cared about. When the recruiter called with the number, he sounded pleased in a way I hadn't realized I was starving for. Good score, he said. You did real well. Real well. Nothing fancy. Still landed harder than it should have. Because praise from strangers hits differently when the people at home have spent years treating your competence like a convenience. I didn't tell my mother. She never asked where I'd been that afternoon anyway. That's not me being dramatic. She genuinely didn't notice. Or if she did, she filed it under one of the many parts of my life she had decided no longer required her involvement. I came home, put my backpack down, made a sandwich, did my homework, went to work, and the day just folded into the next one like I hadn't quietly taken the first real exam of my escape plan. Sometimes neglect isn't loud enough to defend yourself against. It just keeps giving you proof that if you disappeared correctly, the house might take a while to notice. After the ASVAB came MEPS. That part made everything feel less theoretical. Paperwork, physicals, tests, blood draws, stupid waiting room conversations with other kids trying to look calm. It's one thing to fantasize about getting out. It's another to sit in a government building surrounded by people who are also standing at the edge of some version of before and after. I passed on September 15th. The recruiter called me that afternoon and said, "Congratulations." I sat in my car in the school parking lot with the engine off and the windows down because the air conditioner had been dying for months, and I just stared ahead at nothing while he talked me through the next steps. Contract, job, ship date. Everything was becoming a sequence instead of a dream. When he told me October 23rd was open, 5 weeks away, I said yes so fast he laughed. "You don't need to think about it? I've been thinking about it for years." That wasn't technically true, but it felt true. Maybe because leaving isn't something kids like me decide once. We decide it 100 times in smaller ways first. The contract just made it official. I signed for 11X, infantry, not because I had some cinematic vision of myself turning into a war movie poster. Mostly because I wanted something hard, clear, immediate. Something nobody in my house could shrink into an embarrassing little phase. I didn't want an exit people could talk down into a soft choice. I wanted one that would sound final even to them. My ship date was October 23rd. 72 hours after my 18th birthday. 5 weeks from the day I signed. 38 days from the day I passed MEPS. Once I had the date, the whole operation changed. Planning became movement. I started taking my life out of the house one bag at a time. Nothing dramatic. That was the key. No giant trash bags by the door. No half-empty room overnight. Just enough missing each week that the absence looked random if you weren't paying attention. A hoodie here. Extra shoes there. Old notebooks. Chargers. The good blanket my grandmother bought me when I was 8. My Xbox. A framed photo I didn't even like that much, but still didn't want left behind for somebody to toss when my room became a guest room or a storage space or a nursery extension or whatever shape neglected sons get erased into after they leave quietly enough. Amanda's mom saved me on that part. Amanda and I had English together sophomore year and stayed friends mostly because she was one of those people who could tell when someone had learned to keep too much inside. She wasn't dramatic about it. Never tried to pry. Just the kind of person who made space without acting like she deserved a medal for it. When I finally told her I was leaving after graduation, well, not after graduation, before it technically, she didn't do the fake shock thing. She just asked where I was putting my stuff. I said I didn't know yet. The next day she said her mom had a garage and didn't care. That was it. No speech. No guilt trip. No, are you sure? Just logistics. It's wild how much love can sound like logistics when you've grown up around people who only notice your needs after they become inconvenient. So I got methodical. I'd put something in my backpack before school, take it to Amanda's after, and come home carrying the same bag like nothing had changed. If something was too big, I'd move it on a shift day and say I was going to Amanda's after work. Most of the time, my mother just nodded and turned back toward Violet's homework or Ethan's soccer stuff or whatever one of the little kids needed that day. My closet started thinning out. My shelves too. Less clutter. Fewer cables. Fewer pieces of me. And still almost nothing. One evening, she paused in my doorway and glanced inside. "Did you sell some of your clothes?" I was sitting on the floor pretending to sort laundry. "Yeah," I said. "Needed gas money." She nodded. Walked away. That was it. No follow-up. Not which clothes. Not why I suddenly needed gas money. Not why the room looked less like a teenage bedroom every time she passed it. I remember sitting there after she left and just staring at the open closet for a full minute. There's a kind of hurt that doesn't even flare anymore. It just confirms itself. That moment did. If I'd told her the truth right then, actually, I'm emptying this room because I'm joining the army and I'm done being invisible here, I honestly don't know if she would have heard the whole sentence or just the part that inconvenienced her. Violet was harder. She was 9 then, almost 10, and too smart for the kinds of lies adults use on younger kids. She noticed objects the way some people notice weather. Not all at once. Pattern first, then absence. One night she came into my room while I was wrapping cords around my Xbox. "Why are you moving that?" "Lending it to a friend." She crossed her arms. "Which friend?" "Amanda." She narrowed her eyes in this way that reminded me painfully of our mother, except without the manipulation. Violet used observation like she was trying to solve a puzzle fairly. My mother used it to avoid responsibility. For how long? A while. That answer bothered her. I could tell. She stepped farther into the room and looked around. "Your room looks weird." I smiled a little. "Thanks. I'm serious." "I know." She turned slowly, taking inventory without even meaning to. Less stuff on the desk. Fewer books. The top shelf half empty. Posters taken down one at a time so the blank spaces on the wall looked accidental instead of planned. "You're doing something," she said. I said, "Everybody's always doing something." That annoyed her. "Why are you talking like an old man?" I laughed. That part was real. Violet had a way of making me feel older and younger at the same time. She came over and sat on the bed. "Are you mad at Mom?" The question was so direct it almost knocked the air out of me. Kids ask the questions adults avoid because they haven't learned yet that families prefer smoother lies. I sat beside her with the Xbox controller still in my hand. "I'm tired," I said. She considered that. "That's not the same thing." No, it wasn't. But it was the part one could say without dragging her into a war she was still too young to understand. Violet wasn't the villain in any of this. Ethan wasn't either. They were just the children my mother had energy for. That sounds harsh, but it's true. Some parents don't neglect all their kids equally. They pour what they have into the ones who fit the version of life they most want to protect, and the others learn to translate absence into character building before they're old enough to name it as loss. "I'm okay," I told her. She looked at me for a long second, then said, "That's also not the same thing." I had to look away at that, because the truth was, she had become the only person in that house whose attention didn't feel accidental. And that made what I was doing harder than I wanted it to be. Not because I doubted leaving, because I knew she was going to be collateral damage. The next few weeks got tighter. My countdown was running in the back of every day now. 30 days, 27, 22, numbers like a pulse under everything. At school, I filled out ordinary forms and smiled through ordinary conversations like I hadn't already chosen a life none of my family knew was coming. At home, I moved around the house with the weird calm of someone who knows the ending and is just waiting for the scene to catch up. My mother stayed busy. Phil stayed pleasantly useless in the specific way men like him do when a family system benefits them. He wasn't a monster. That would have been simpler. Monsters make things easier to name. Phil was just comfortable. Comfortable with the house orbiting the younger kids. Comfortable with my mother making excuses. Comfortable with a version of parenting where the oldest child mostly raised himself and caused no paperwork. Once, about 2 weeks before I left, he asked me whether I planned on sticking with Wendy's after graduation. That was the closest either of them came to asking about my future. I said, "Probably not." He nodded like that settled something and turned back to whatever game Ethan was watching. "Probably not." That line almost makes me laugh now. No, Phil. Not Wendy's. Not this house. Not this version of me either. The closer I got to leaving, the calmer I looked. I think people mistake calm for acceptance all the time. It isn't. Sometimes calm is what happens when someone has finally decided the relationship is over and the only thing left is timing. That was me by early October. Done emotionally. Done hoping. Done trying to earn a place in a house that had spent years teaching me I was extra. All that was left was execution. And then, 3 days before I was supposed to leave, my biological father called for the first time in 14 years. That call should have felt like a complication. Instead, it felt like the story taking one more turn just before the end. 3 days before I left, my biological father called me from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Normally, I don't pick up unknown calls. And back then, I definitely didn't have the kind of life where mystery numbers usually led anywhere good. I was in the Wendy's parking lot again, finishing a cheap iced coffee I didn't even want because I needed something to do before going back into the house. The phone buzzed. New Jersey number. I let it ring twice, then hit accept mostly out of boredom. "Hey," a man said. Too quickly, voice rough and overeager all at once. "Hey, it's Raymond." I didn't say anything. He filled the silence immediately, like he'd expected one and had been rehearsing against it. "Your dad. Well, bio-dad, I guess. I just got out 2 weeks ago. I'm staying at my parents' old place off Route 9. They left it to me after they passed. I know this is weird. I know it's late. He stopped, took a breath I could hear through the phone, and said, much quieter, "Can we talk?" If you've gone 14 years without hearing someone's voice, you think the first feeling will be anger, or curiosity, or some dramatic rush of grief. Mine was caution, not because I had forgiven him, because I had built a life around not expecting fathers to show up correctly. One of them had been gone for most of my memory. The other had been in the house and still somehow absent in all the ways that count. So no, I wasn't about to hear one shaky phone call and suddenly start narrating myself into some sentimental reunion. I said, "Why now?" He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Because I should have called the day I got out and I already failed you enough." That answer did something small but important. It didn't fix anything, but it told me he wasn't going to open with excuses. That mattered. He asked if we could meet somewhere public. My choice. I picked a Denny's off Route 9 because if you're going to meet the father you haven't seen since preschool 3 days before you disappear into the army, you may as well do it somewhere with sticky menus and bad coffee. At least then nobody can mistake the moment for something more polished than it is. I got there 10 minutes early and still almost turned around. Not because I was scared of him, because some part of me understood that once I sat down in that booth, I would have to face the weird possibility that the man who had missed almost my entire life might still manage to say one true thing at the exact moment my actual mother had run out of them. That felt dangerous. Hope always does when it shows up late. He was already there when I walked in. Booth near the window, hands wrapped around a coffee mug he clearly wasn't drinking from. He stood up the second he saw me, then stopped halfway, like he didn't know whether standing was respectful or ridiculous after 14 years of nothing. He looked older than 42. Way older. Prison had put this dry, worn look on him, like the years had sanded him down too aggressively. His shoulders were still broad but caved a little. His hair was thinner than I expected. His face had the kind of lines men usually earn from labor and worry, except his looked compressed, like too much damage had happened in places sunlight never reached. "Hey," he said again. Same word as on the phone. Smaller this time. I slid into the booth across from him and said, "Hey." That was enough to get us seated. For a few seconds we just looked at each other. Not warmly, not hostile either. More like two people checking whether the other one existed in the same shape memory had left behind. I was trying to find myself in his face and failing, which made sense since I barely remembered it in the first place. He was staring at me the way people stare at lost time when it sits down wearing a hoodie and car keys. The waitress came over and asked if we wanted coffee. He said yes. I said Coke. When she left, he rubbed both hands over his jeans and said, "You look taller." I actually laughed a little. "You have nothing else?" That embarrassed him, but in a way I respected. Not defensive, just honest. "Probably a lot," he said. "I'm just trying not to screw up the first sentence." That was the first moment I believed he might actually understand what he had lost. Not fully. Nobody can understand 14 years they didn't live. But enough. I leaned back and said, "Then don't start with prison changed you." He gave one tight nod. "Fair. Good." I didn't want a rehabilitation speech. I didn't want a redemption arc delivered over diner coffee. I didn't need him to explain nonviolent charges or bad choices or the legal machine or who betrayed him or how hard things were inside. Maybe some of that was true. Maybe all of it was. But there are facts that matter less than the absences they cause. He had been gone. That was the fact. So I made him sit in it. He looked down at the table and said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Simple sentence. Cleaner than most people manage. I said nothing. He tried again. Not in the vague way people say that when they want credit. I mean, I know I missed everything. School. Birthdays. You growing up. All of it. Still nothing from me. He deserved the silence. He took it. That mattered too. A lot of adults, especially parents, can apologize only if you help them emotionally through the discomfort of apologizing. My mother was like that. Any confrontation with her turned into unpaid labor because before you knew it, you were comforting the person who hurt you. Raymond, for whatever other failures belonged to him, at least seemed to understand that this meeting was not about making himself feel forgiven faster. He said, "Your mom told me almost nothing over the years." I let out a short breath through my nose. "That makes two of us." He nodded. There was a pause, and then he asked, carefully, "How are things there?" That question almost made me laugh for a completely different reason. Things there. As if there was a place with weather and not the emotional climate of a house where I'd been fading out in slow motion for 8 years. I looked out the window at traffic for a second and decided, for reasons I still don't fully understand, not to lie. "Not great," I said. He waited. No interruption. So I kept going. I told him the broad version first. Mom married Phil. Things were okay for a while. Then Violet was born. Then Ethan. Then I became convenient to forget. I kept it spare at first because I didn't want to sound like I was auditioning for sympathy. But once the outline was there, the details started coming with it. Eating alone. Walking home. The errands that came back with arcade cups and shopping bags. My 16th birthday. The Olive Garden. The cake line. My separate bank account. The recruiter. SFOB. MEPS. October 23rd. The date I said out loud made him look up sharply. "You're leaving that soon?" 72 hours. For a second he just stared at me. Then he put both palms flat on the table like he needed them there to steady himself. "You joined the army." "Yeah." He looked down and laughed once, except it wasn't really a laugh. More like a sound of disbelief leaving the body too fast. He shook his head, rubbed at one eye, then the other, and when he spoke again his voice was gone around the edges. "I miss everything, and still somehow you turn into the kind of kid who does that." I didn't know what to say to that, because no one in my house had talked about what I was doing like it required anything admirable. They didn't even know. The closest anyone had come was Phil asking if I planned to stay at Wendy's after graduation, which in hindsight feels like a joke somebody too tired to laugh at would write. Raymond looked at me and said, "That takes guts." Something in my chest shifted. Tiny movement. Still huge. I don't mean I suddenly loved him. I mean that after years of being treated like a logistical leftover, hearing an adult man look straight at me and describe a hard thing I had done as courage instead of inconvenience hit harder than it should have. He noticed. That was the whole miracle. He noticed. The waitress came back with our drinks, saw his face, and asked if everything was okay. He wiped at his eyes too fast and said, "Yeah, sorry. Just proud of my son." That should have felt wrong coming from him. Maybe it did a little, but not enough to stop the damage. Because pride, even borrowed and late and not fully earned, still sounds different from neglect. After she left, I said, "Don't call me that." He nodded immediately. "Okay." No argument. No wounded parent act. Just okay. Again, that mattered. I said, I can maybe forgive you eventually, but I'm not calling you Dad. Not now. Maybe not ever. You'd have to earn that. He looked like the sentence hurt, which was reasonable, and then he nodded again. I understand. And weirdly enough, I believed that too. That may have been the strangest part of the whole meeting. Not that he was sorry. That he wasn't fighting the terms. He didn't say blood is blood. Didn't say I was being harsh. Didn't say prison stole his chance and I owed him compassion because life had been hard. He just sat there and accepted that whatever relationship existed between us would have to be built from almost nothing, and that he would be the one doing most of the lifting. He said, You don't owe me the word, or the role. I know that. I looked at him over my Coke and thought, this is the first honest father-shaped sentence I've heard in years. Which is a brutal thought to have about a man who was absent for 14 of them. That's what neglect does though. It lowers the bar so badly that sincerity from the wrong person can feel revolutionary. We sat there for almost an hour. I learned little things. He was staying at my grandparents' old house because they'd left it to him before they died. He'd gotten out 2 weeks earlier and spent most of that time trying to figure out whether calling me would help or just reopen damage. He'd quit trying to contact my mother through letters years ago because she stopped answering. He had a cousin helping him find work. He smoked less now. He slept badly. He hated that he didn't know whether I played sports, what subjects I liked, whether I had friends, whether I was the kind of kid who liked cake or hated birthdays or ever thought about him at all. That last one got me. Not because I pitied him. Because he was grieving specifics. My mother had been neglecting specifics for years. She knew what size shoes I wore because she still bought school stuff sometimes. She knew my work schedule in theory because I needed rides when the car acted up. She knew when parent forms were due if signing one saved her embarrassment. But she didn't know me in the way this man, who had been gone since I was 3, was suddenly desperate to know me. That comparison felt almost unfair. And yet there it was. At one point he asked, Do they know you're leaving? I said, No. He sat back slowly. You're really doing this? Yeah. You gonna tell her? I looked at the window again. Cars, light poles, late traffic. The kind of ordinary evening that makes private decisions feel even sharper because the world refuses to stop and underline them for you. I'm leaving a letter. He nodded once. Good. Not because he thought it would help her. Because he understood documentation. I appreciated that too. A clean record. A final account. No room later for her to say she had no idea, that I never gave her a chance, that boys my age are moody and mysterious and she did the best she could. The letter would ruin all those escape routes. When I told him that part, he gave the tiniest hint of a smile. Good, he said again. Put it in writing. That made me smile back before I could stop it. He noticed that too. Didn't celebrate it. Didn't grab at it. Just let it happen. By the time the check came, something had changed in me. Not softened. Clarified. Leaving had already been the plan. Nothing about Denny's created that plan. My mother and Phil had done that all by themselves over years of small, efficient abandonments. But the meeting did something I hadn't expected. It removed the last bit of guilt I still had about going without a scene. Because if the parent who had failed me most visibly could sit across from me, accept what he had done, and still manage to look me in the face and say I'm proud of you, then what exactly was my mother's excuse? She had all the access he didn't. All the years. All the mornings. All the birthdays. All the ordinary Tuesdays where love either gets practiced or neglected into dust. And she had still ended up knowing less about me than a man fresh out of prison with diner coffee on his breath and tears in his eyes. That realization sealed something. When we stood up to leave, he hesitated like he wanted to hug me and knew better than to try. I stuck out my hand. It was awkward and weird and probably looked more like a job interview than a reunion. He took it like it was something fragile. Be smart, he said. I will. Come back alive. There are sentences that sound normal until you hear them at the right moment. That was one of them. Not because I was naive enough to think infantry came with guarantees. because no one at home had said anything close to come back in years. I let go of his hand and said, "I'll try." He looked like he wanted to say more, then didn't. Good choice. Too many words would have spoiled it. As I walked back to my car, I realized something I hated admitting even to myself. The meeting had hurt, not in the obvious way, not because he disappointed me, because he didn't. He showed up late, imperfectly, carrying a history that could never be cleaned up enough to call simple. But he still showed up more honestly in one diner booth than my mother had managed in years of sharing a house with me. That is a brutal thing for a son to understand 3 days before he leaves home for good. So that night, when I got back to the house and heard Phil helping Ethan with something in the living room while my mother asked Violet about school, I stood in the kitchen for a second and looked at all of it differently. Not sadder, clearer. This wasn't a family I was abandoning. It was a system I had survived. And now I was almost out. All that remained was the letter. And that letter was going to say everything they spent years pretending not to see. I wrote the letter over 2 nights. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say. Because once I started, I realized I had been storing evidence for years. There's a difference between pain and inventory. Pain is messy. Inventory is organized. Pain cries in the dark and wonders if it's overreacting. Inventory writes things down in order and stops asking for permission to call them what they were. By the time I sat at my desk with a legal pad and a pen that kept skipping, I wasn't trying to hurt my mother for sport. I was trying to make sure she never got to rewrite me. That was important, because people like her don't usually deny facts. They soften them, reframe them, sand the edges down until your whole childhood sounds like one long misunderstanding. They say things like, "I did my best," or "You were always so independent," or "I thought you liked having space," or "You never said anything." I knew every version of the lie before she even spoke it. So the letter had to be specific. That was rule 1. Not emotional first. Specific first. I started with the small things because those were the things people always dismiss when they're trying to save themselves. The dinners in the living room while I ate alone in the kitchen. The school walks. The times she chose the baby's nap schedule over being my mother. The afternoons I came home to an empty house because errands apparently took 6 hours and somehow always came back with pizza boxes and arcade prizes. Then I got meaner. Not louder. Cleaner. I wrote about the first Saturday I realized they had left me behind on purpose. About standing in the kitchen looking at Violet's missing shoes and Ethan's jacket and understanding, before the text even came, that I had not been forgotten by accident. I wrote about how quickly we thought you were still sleeping taught me more about her than any apology ever could. I wrote about being called easy. That one took a full paragraph because I wanted her to understand exactly why that word made me sick. Easy wasn't a compliment. Easy meant I had learned not to cost her anything emotionally. Easy meant she had turned my silence into convenience, and then congratulated herself for raising a mature kid. Then I wrote about my 16th birthday. That part came out fast. Too fast. I had to stop afterward and go stand in the bathroom just to breathe for a second. It was strange how cleanly some memories had survived. The exact sound of the garage door. The Olive Garden bags. The stupid paper sleeve around the breadsticks. Her face when she saw me by the stairs. The lazy speed of the lie. "I thought you were eating at a friend's house." Violet asking where my cake was. My mother saying he's too old for that stuff now, like care came with an expiration date. I wrote all of it. Every line. Every cowardly shortcut. Every little moment that had trained me to make myself smaller so the rest of them could stay comfortable. By the end of the first night, I had 3 pages and a hand cramp. I didn't stop because I was done. I stopped because I realized the letter was no longer about whether she understood me. It was about whether I understood myself clearly enough to leave without guilt. That's different. Kids who grow up neglected usually don't need help remembering what happened. We need help trusting that it mattered. So I wrote the letter like I was building a case for myself. If I ever started wondering later whether I had been too harsh, too dramatic, too cold, I wanted something to point at. Something better than memory. Something written in my own hand before distance or nostalgia had a chance to edit the truth. The second night I got to the real point. I wrote that I wasn't leaving because of one birthday or one lie or one missed family outing. I was leaving because she had made invisibility the price of peace in her house. I wrote that she had already said goodbye to me 100 times. She just did it in ways small enough that nobody else had to call her cruel. I wrote that if she was shocked I could leave without warning, then maybe for once she should try experiencing her own parenting from the receiving end. That line almost didn't make the final version. Then I left it in, because it was true. I wrote about Wendy's, about the separate bank account, about every paycheck, about saving $3,200 by refusing myself the kind of stupid little teenage comforts normal kids get to waste money on because I had bigger problems than fun. I wrote that while other people my age were planning prom or community college or gap year nonsense with parents who at least pretended to care, I was calculating the cheapest path out of a house where I had become background noise. Then I wrote the sentence I knew she'd read more than once. I would rather risk dying overseas than spend one more year being invisible in your house. That one didn't feel dramatic when I wrote it. Felt measured. That scared me a little. Not because it wasn't true, because of how true it was. I didn't tell her outright that I'd enlisted. I wanted her to work for that conclusion. I wanted the letter to make her sit in uncertainty the way I had sat in neglect, quietly, with no one offering comfort fast enough to matter. But I gave her enough. The timing, the finality, the fact that my room was being emptied, the fact that I wasn't asking for space. I was taking it. On the last page, I wrote the one thing I had avoided saying out loud for years because saying it would have made the house unlivable before I had an exit. You stopped being my mother long before I stopped being your son. I stared at that line for a long time after I wrote it. Not because it was too harsh, because it wasn't. That was the problem. It was the cleanest thing in the whole letter. I folded the pages carefully, front and back, and slid them into an envelope without sealing it. No point. This wasn't something she could send back unopened. Then I put it in my desk drawer and waited for the morning. My last 2 days in the house were almost peaceful. That's what happens when a decision is final. The arguing in your head stops. Every room becomes temporary. Every annoying sound loses power. My mother asked me once if I'd be home for dinner Friday. I said maybe. Phil asked if I could take out the trash before work. I said sure. Ethan wanted help finding one of his cleats. Violet followed me around more than usual, like she could feel something shifting under the floorboards and didn't know what. She caught me in my room the night before I left while I was zipping the duffel. Not because I'd gotten sloppy, because she was paying attention. She stood in the doorway and looked at the bag, then at me, then at the half-empty room that even my mother could no longer have explained away if she'd bothered to really see it. "You're leaving," Violet said. Not a question. I set the duffel down. There are moments when telling the truth to a kid feels more respectful than protecting them with one more soft lie. This was one of them. "Yeah," I said. Her face changed immediately. Not dramatic tears. Just the stunned little collapse around the eyes. "For how long?" "A while." That's not an answer. No, it wasn't. But she was still 10, and I was still her half-brother. And there were limits to what I was willing to put on a child at 11 o'clock in a hallway house full of sleeping people. She stepped into the room and shut the door behind her. "Did Mom know?" I almost laughed at the question, not because it was funny, but because it contained the whole tragedy of our family in 7 words. Violet still lived in a world where mothers knew things. I had been living outside that world for years. "No," I said. "Are you coming back?" That one I couldn't soften. "Not to live." She stared at me for a long second and then said the one thing I didn't expect. "She's going to cry." I leaned against the desk. "Probably." Violet looked down at the floor. "Then why are you doing it?" That question deserved a real answer. So I gave her one. Because staying where people don't really see you can mess you up worse than leaving. She didn't fully understand that. I could tell. But she felt the weight of it anyway. Kids always do. Her eyes got shiny and she nodded once like she was trying very hard not to make me choose between comforting her and protecting myself. That almost broke me more than anything my mother had done. I crouched down so we were eye level and said, "None of this is because of you." She nodded again too quickly, which is how I knew she didn't fully believe it. So I said it a second time. "None of this is because of you." This time she whispered, "I know." Then she threw her arms around me. I hugged her back and had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep my face steady. Because that was the real cost. Not leaving my mother. Not leaving Phil. Leaving the one kid in that house who had noticed enough to ask the right questions and was still young enough to think questions could fix things. When she pulled back, she looked angry suddenly. Not at me. At the whole situation in the vague, powerless way children get angry when they can feel injustice but can't reach the machinery that made it. "Do they know they're bad at this?" she asked. I almost smiled. "Probably not. They should." "Yeah," I said. "They should." She wiped under one eye with the heel of her hand and looked at the duffel again. "When?" "Early." "How early?" "Before sunrise." She nodded slowly like she was filing the numberless answer away beside everything else she had quietly understood in that house. Then she asked, "Can I say bye now?" That one got me. I said, "Yeah." So she did. Not with some big movie speech. Just, "Bye." In this small, furious voice. Like she was mad at the whole idea of a goodbye that had to happen in advance because the adults in the house couldn't be trusted with the truth. I said bye back. She opened the door, paused, then looked over her shoulder and said, "I'm still going to text you." "Okay. You better answer sometimes." "I will." That seemed to satisfy her enough to leave. After the door shut, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in a room that barely looked like mine anymore and listened to the house breathe around me. Pipes knocking. Fridge humming downstairs. Somebody turning over in their sleep. The ordinary sounds of a home I had spent years trying to deserve and was finally done begging to belong to. I didn't sleep much. At 3:37 a.m., I got up, showered, dressed, and zipped the duffel for the last time. Jeans, hoodie, sneakers. Nothing dramatic. No soundtrack. No heroic feeling. Just the physical movements of a person leaving one life before the other one had officially started. At 3:58, I took the envelope from my desk drawer and walked downstairs. The kitchen looked different at that hour. Cleaner. Colder. The kind of room where every object seems a little accusatory because there are no people around to animate it with excuses. I set the envelope in the middle of the counter where she couldn't miss it if she actually looked. Then I stood there for a second. I wish I could tell you I felt powerful. Mostly I felt done. Not empty. Completed. Like a fuse had burned all the way down and there was finally nothing left to wait for. My Uber headlights slid across the front window at 4:03. I picked up the duffel, opened the front door, and stepped into the dark. The air was cold enough to wake everything in me at once. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of deep suburban quiet that makes any departure feel slightly criminal just because nobody else is moving. The car idled at the curb. The driver glanced back when he heard my bag hit the trunk, gave me the quick professional once-over of somebody deciding whether I looked like trouble, and then nodded when I slid into the back seat. As we pulled away, I looked across the street. Raymond was standing on the porch of my grandparents' old house. I hadn't told him he needed to be there, hadn't asked. But there he was anyway, in jeans and a jacket, shoulders squared against the cold. One hand at his side and the other rising in a clean, awkward salute as the car rolled past. It should have looked ridiculous. Didn't. It looked like the only goodbye in my life that morning that had any weight behind it. I didn't salute back. I didn't wave either. I just looked at him through the glass and gave the smallest nod I could manage. He nodded once too. Then the car turned at the corner and he was gone. I didn't look back after that. Not at the house. Not at the street. Not at the window that might or might not already have my mother standing behind it if she had woken up early enough to notice my room was finally empty. There are moments when looking back is love. And there are moments when it's just another chance to weaken. I had already used up too many years weakening myself for that house. So I faced forward. We drove through dark roads and empty intersections and the weird half-dead hour where the world hasn't decided whether it's night anymore. My phone stayed silent for most of it. No calls. No frantic texts. No sudden realization transmitted through glowing glass. That felt right, honestly. Their version of missing me had always been delayed. When the first text finally came, the sky was already getting lighter. I looked down. My mother. How could you leave like this? Without saying goodbye. I read it once. Then again. And something in me went perfectly still. Because even now, even after the letter, even after the years, even after waking up to a house with one son missing and 4 pages on the counter explaining exactly why, her first instinct was still not "Are you safe?" Not "Where are you?" Not "I'm sorry." It was accusation. How could you do this to me? That was the whole story right there. Not just of that morning. Of all the mornings before it. I didn't answer. I turned the phone over in my lap and watched the road ahead. If she wanted a goodbye, she should have noticed all the smaller ones. My mother texted 3 more times before noon. The second one came 40 minutes after the first. "Where are you?" The third. "Please answer me." And the fourth was the one that finally made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her. "Violet is crying." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I should have done better." Not "I read what you wrote and I know I failed you." Just a fresh attempt to pull me back into the same role I'd always had in that house. The easy one. The absorbent one. The kid expected to rush in and help manage everybody else's feelings before he was ever allowed to have his own. I kept the phone face down. That was the first real boundary I'd ever held with her. Not yelling. Not explaining. Not negotiating. Silence. People think silence is passive because it doesn't make much noise. They're wrong. Silence, used correctly, is refusal. It says the work you want from me is no longer available. It says I finally understand that answering too early would just rebuild the same bridge I had nearly died trying to cross every day. By the time I got where I was supposed to be, there were 2 missed calls from her, one from Phil and another text. "You are being cruel." That one almost impressed me. There it was again, that talent some parents have for finding the exact moment when consequences arrive and immediately trying to rename them abuse. Cruel. Not the dinners alone. Not the 6-hour errands. Not the 16th birthday with Olive Garden for everybody but me. Not the years of making me smaller because I was easier to disappoint than the family she actually wanted to enjoy. No, apparently the cruel part was finally leaving. I should probably tell you that text made me doubt myself. Didn't. That's the part I'm proudest of now. Not the army contract. Not the savings account. Not even the fact that I got out at all. I'm proud that when she said the word cruel, I didn't immediately start cross-examining my own pain to see if maybe she was right. That used to be my first reflex with her. She'd say something selfish and I'd go looking for the version of it that made me the problem. That day I didn't. That day I just looked at the screen and thought, "No, you're just late." Reception was a blur of paperwork, waiting, duffel bags, shaved heads, fluorescent lights, instructions shouted by people who had no interest in your personal history. It should have felt dehumanizing. Instead it felt clean. That probably sounds insane if you've never come from a house where invisibility was your job. But there's a strange relief in being processed by a system that doesn't pretend to love you while failing you. At least there the rules were out in the open. At least there the hardness had a name. At home, neglect had always arrived wearing normal clothes. At basic, everything was honest from the start. Stand here. Do this. Move faster. Shut up. Eat now. Sleep now. Wake up. No fake warmth. No lazy lies. No half-hearted family language hiding a total lack of care. I didn't love it exactly, but I respected it immediately. It's easier to adapt to hard truth than soft abandonment. The first chance I got to check my phone again, there were even more messages. Some angry, some panicked, some trying on concern like a jacket she only remembered she owned after the weather changed. Call me now. I can't believe you would do this after everything I've done for you. If this is about your birthday, you are blowing this way out of proportion. That one actually made my jaw tighten. Because of course she would do that. Take years and compress them into one event small enough to dismiss. That's what people like my mother do when a ledger finally lands in front of them. They don't argue every line item. They just try to reduce the whole total into one petty misunderstanding and act shocked you're upset. If this is about your birthday, as if the Olive Garden bags were the wound. As if the wound wasn't an entire childhood spent learning that even on days designed to mark my existence, I could still be treated like optional seating. There was one message from Phil too. Just one. Your mom is upset. You should call her. That was so perfectly him I almost smiled. No accountability. No admission. No, we messed this up. Just task reassignment. Your mother is distressed. So please return to your lifelong position as the easiest person in the house to burden. I didn't answer him either. But there was one message I did answer. Came from Violet. No accusation. No guilt trip. No adult manipulation hiding inside a short sentence. Just, are you okay? I stared at that text for a long time, because that was the difference right there. Same house. Same morning. Same loss. But the 10-year-old knew the first question was safety, while the adults had gone straight to blame. I typed back, yeah, I'm okay. This isn't your fault. She answered almost immediately. Mom is freaking out. I could picture it. My mother at the kitchen counter with the letter open. The envelope discarded. My empty room upstairs. My closet half bare in a way she must have suddenly realized had not happened by accident. Phil pacing uselessly, contributing nothing but atmosphere. Ethan confused. Violet standing there absorbing way too much because in families like mine, the most observant kids are always the first ones forced to understand the truth. I typed, I know. Then, take care of yourself, okay? She sent back, will you come back? That question hit harder in text than it had in person the night before. Because now the house had changed around her too. Now she was asking from inside the crater instead of the hallway before the explosion. I took a while before answering. Finally I wrote, not for a long time. She sent, okay, I still love you. That nearly cracked me open. Not because I doubted it. Because it came from the only person in that house who hadn't made love feel transactional. I wrote, love you too. Then I put the phone away. That became the pattern. No response to my mother. No response to Phil. A few short replies to Violet when I could manage them. My mother kept trying anyway. Anger first. Then confusion. Then the kind of revisionist grief people perform when they can feel the story sliding out of their control. She sent things like, you know I always loved you. You have no idea how hard things were when the little kids were small. I did the best I could. That one made me laugh again. Not because raising kids is easy. It isn't. I know that. I probably knew that before she did, honestly, because kids like me get trained early to account for adult stress before our own needs are even named. But I did the best I could is one of those sentences that sounds noble until you set it next to the evidence. Your best remembered to bring back arcade prizes but not your oldest son. Your best could organize nap schedules but not sign school papers on time. Your best found a way to feed 4 people Olive Garden on my 16th birthday and still tell yourself I had somehow made my own absence happen. No, that wasn't her best. That was just the version of motherhood she found most convenient. The more she texted, the clearer something became to me. She had no actual language for what she had done. Only language for how my reaction made her feel. That's how you know an apology isn't ready yet. When the person still describes the damage mostly in terms of their own shock, their own heartbreak, their own confusion, their own need to be reassured that they're not a villain. I wasn't interested in giving her any of that. I had spent too many years making her feel better about things she should have been ashamed of. The army gave me a new schedule fast. Wake up before your body wants to. Move when told. Carry what's handed to you. Shut off whatever soft self used to spend hours replaying home like a courtroom transcript. It was exhausting. It was painful. It was also weirdly useful. For the first time in my life, the hardest thing about my day was the thing actually happening in front of me. Not the emotional archaeology of trying to interpret whether I mattered in my own house. Not the constant low-grade humiliation of being the extra kid in your mother's real family. Just the day. Just the grind. Just the next order. I got stronger there. Not in the movie way. Not instantly. Just incrementally. Shoulders. Sleep discipline. Tolerance for discomfort. Ability to function when tired. Ability to hear criticism without translating it into evidence that I was unwanted. That last part mattered more than the push-ups. And every time I thought about my mother, it got simpler. Not easier. Simpler. She had had years. That was the whole case. She had had mornings and dinners and school weeks and birthdays and ordinary boring days when nothing dramatic was happening and love still could have been practiced in 100 small ways. And she hadn't done it. There's a temptation, once distance enters the story, to start sanding down the truth yourself. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe she really didn't see it. Maybe mothers are human and I was too hard on her, and maybe. I fought that every time it started up by going back to the same fact. A child should not have to disappear in installments before his own mother notices he is leaving. That ended the debate every time. Weeks later, after the messages had slowed down from frantic to periodic, she sent one that almost looked like self-awareness. Almost. It said, "I wish you had told me sooner how bad you felt." I stared at that one longer than the others, because on the surface it sounds reasonable, even vulnerable. But underneath it was the same dodge she had always used. If you had communicated better, maybe I could have behaved better. In other words, the burden circles right back where it started. On the child. On the neglected one. On the person already doing all the emotional labor in the room. I never answered it. What I wanted to say was, I did tell you. I told you every time I came downstairs to an empty house and stood there too long. I told you every time I stopped asking to be included because your excuses were humiliating. I told you on my birthday when I stood by the stairs staring at food for 4. I told you with every silence you called maturity. I told you when my room got emptier and emptier and you still chose not to look. You just liked me better when my pain stayed convenient. But I didn't send any of that, because by then I understood something important. Not every truth needs to be delivered twice. She had the letter. That was enough. Months later, when I finally let myself replay that morning without anger trying to narrate over it, what stayed with me wasn't her first text or Phil's useless one, or even the silence of the house behind me. It was Raymond on the porch. A man who had forfeited the right to call himself my father, still somehow understanding that a departure like mine deserved witness. And my mother, who had every legal and moral claim to the title, not even waking up in time to watch me leave. That contrast told the whole story better than any speech ever could. I didn't cut her off because I stopped loving her overnight. I cut her off because she had spent years loving me like I was optional, and one day I finally believed her. She asked how I could leave without saying goodbye. The truth was, I had been saying goodbye for years. She was just the last one to hear it.